Hello, my name is Putkonen. Thank you for joining me. Today I'm talking about fragmentation, the source of seeking and conflict. The root, the core of seeking, in particular spiritual seeking, is this lack or absence that is felt. We're continually trying to fill something that seems to be missing. And this missingness is part and parcel with fragmentation, the little me and separate than others. That me can never become whole. It's always a piece. The me literally is identifying with a piece. And so fragmentation of this sort, when you're breaking off or you're creating this separation, and so there's me as a separate piece, fragment, separate from all these other fragments around, this fragmentation fundamentally will create the search and seeking, because there is a drive to wholeness, a drive to being complete, to no longer being lacking something. Now, this fragmentation also pairs with conflict. As soon as there is fragmentation, there's conflict. Jiddu Krishnamurti, in one of his video clips I recently saw, he was talking specifically about fragmentation being the source of conflict. He goes, as soon as there's fragmentation, there's conflict. They arise together. And this kind of makes sense, because if you are thinking about, say, let's think about a finite space. Let's say there's a swimming pool with two blobs in it. For there to be motion, for there to be a movement, one will have to push against the other so it can create the necessary space to move. And so as soon as there's fragmentation, if there's two in an enclosed system, there will necessarily be conflict automatically. Because there's always going to be motion. It's not static. And so in order for one to move, the other must give way. And if the one doesn't want to give way, it pushes back. And so there's this constant fighting. But in non-duality, there's no other. It's all one. And so the two blobs, so to speak, in this example, are two in name only in the fiction created in mind. It's one fighting against itself in the totality of the space allotted, so to speak. And in this way, in order to fill the void it feels because it believes it is a separate piece, because there is fragmentation, it seeks to be filled. And the only way it can find anything to fill it is outside itself. And so it will feed on the other, try to consume and take from the other, thus also creating the conflict. And so long as there's conflict, there's no inner peace. And the spiritual seeking that we do, so many people are like, I'm just looking for peace. How do I find peace? Well, as long as there's fragmentation, there's conflict. And as long as there's conflict, there's no peace. Peace is there where there is no conflict. And so the only way for peace to arise is overcoming this delusion of fragmentation, of separation. But going back to the analogy I was kind of talking about, where one blob's feeding on the other, but it's really one thing. In a way, That is a lot like the image from mythology when they talk about the Ouroboros, the snake that is feeding on its own tail. The snake wants to fill itself. You could say, feels a lack, feels a hole, and is trying to fill itself. And it's filling itself by eating this thing that it thinks it will complete and fill itself with. But due to ignorance and insensitivity, it doesn't realize that it's just feeding on its own tail. And so, although it thinks it might be making progress, in no way is it really gaining anything, because it is just feeding on itself. It is chewing on its own tail, and so it's never going to fulfill itself. So the myth of Ouroboros is an interesting myth in non-duality, because we tend to do that. Because of fragmentation, there's conflict, there's trying to take from what's outside, trying to complete ourselves. But it's just the snake eating on its own tail. It's not getting anything. It already isn't, there's nothing outside of itself. In trying to consume its tail, it's still itself. Its entirety is still there. And so we don't want to be, ideally, feeding on our own tails all the time, thinking that somehow we're going to be complete in doing this. And we don't realize it's our own tail. We think it's something outside of ourselves. If I just had this, I can complete myself. But there is nothing outside of ourselves. That is the fundamental illusion. There is no other. There's no outside. So, the only way to feel fulfilled, to be complete, to no longer have this hole, this emptiness that you're trying to fill, the only way to finally get peace is to overcome the delusion of fragmentation, the illusion and delusion of separation. And to do this, we often look at this piece, this fragment you feel and think yourself to be. Why is it you've created these mental boundaries, these partitions, and think that you're some piece? You're not a piece. You're not a fragment. You're not a piece of the whole. You are the whole. You are the entirety. And that's what self-realization is realizing the self, which is omnipresent, which has no circumference, has no center, no outside. The self, being the entirety, is whole. By its very nature, is whole, is complete. Lacks nothing, because there's nothing outside it to add. Nothing can be added or subtracted from the self. And so there's nothing needed to complete itself. It is inherently complete, inherently fulfilled. And that's already the case. We're inherently already fulfilled and already complete. It is just the imagination that we're lacking something. It's the delusion that we are missing something. It's the delusion that we're a piece, a fragment, and we need to add something in order to be fulfilled. And so play with, or at least observe, investigate, kind of watch what's going on, and look at the tendency to fragment, to think in terms of I'm a piece, I'm separate, I'm individual, and look at that piece that you feel and think yourself to be, and question it. On what basis do you believe on the borders? On what basis do you believe there being a circumference? How is it that you are just a fragment and a piece of the whole? These basic assumptions these misconceptions that we have are the things that we need to see the false as false. But anyways, if you got any questions, comments, please post below. But until next time, thank you much.